in the Department of Corrections. You are a quadruple murderer who slaughtered innocent children. That is your identity. That is the identity you will carry for the remainder of your life behind prison walls, confined to a 4-foot by 7-foot cell until your final breath. That's the sentence I'm imposing. You have 45 days from today's date to file an appeal of this sentence. If you miss the 45-day deadline, you can get a 30-day good cause exchange.
On May 19, 2026, in a Monmouth County, New Jersey courtroom, Paul Canero learned that his name had been permanently taken from him. He was already a convicted quadruple murderer, found guilty on all 15 counts by a jury that needed less than 5 hours to reach its verdict.
Sophia through her nasal cavity with such violence that it fractured her sinus and penetrated her brain.
Oh, Jesus.
Another stab wound pierced her chest cavity and collapsed her lung. That's what you did. These were catastrophic injuries inflicted with overwhelming force. The natures of the wounds demonstrated repeated acts of...
The mandatory sentence was life without parole 4 times over. But before the judge concluded the hearing, he did something far more permanent than stacking prison terms. He looked at the defendant and said, "You are no longer Paul Canero. You are an intimate number in the Department of Corrections. You are a quadruple murderer who slaughtered innocent children. That is your identity." That moment was not theater. It was a legal declaration, and everything that preceded it was a methodical demolition of the mask Paul Canero had worn for 7.5 years. The facts that led to that moment are almost unbearable to recount. In November of 2018, Paul drove 20 minutes in darkness to his brother Keith's Colts Neck home. He had spent the preceding hours turning off his own surveillance cameras, loading ammunition, and preparing to annihilate an entire family. When he arrived, he shut off the power to disable the security system and waited outside. Keith came out to investigate. Paul shot him multiple times, including an execution-style contact wound to the head as Keith lay face down in the dirt. Then he entered the home where his sister-in-law Jennifer and her 2 children, 11-year-old Jesse and 8-year-old Sophia, were inside. Jennifer had heard the gunshots. She left her bed, unarmed, in a dark house with her babies. Paul shot her in the head with precision, and while she was still alive, he stabbed her repeatedly in the chest, back, and abdomen. Jesse and Sophia heard the violence and left their bedrooms. Their uncle hunted them with a knife. Jesse was stabbed 7 times and had defensive wounds showing he tried to fight. Sophia, all 45 pounds of her, was stabbed over 40 times. 1 wound went through her face into her brain, another collapsed her lung.
49% carboxyhemoglobin level, demonstrating that she remained alive and continued breathing toxic smoke after suffering multiple catastrophic stab wounds. The suffering associated with those final moments of life is almost impossible to comprehend. Sophia endured devastating injuries while simultaneously inhaling poisonous smoke as the fire spread through the home around her. The image presented by the evidence is one of extraordinary cruelty. An injured child, mortally wounded and...
She had defensive wounds all over her body. Then Paul went to the basement, set a slow, burning fire, and drove home to manufacture an alibi. Sophia was still alive. She breathed toxic smoke for hours, her blood eventually showing a 49% carboxyhemoglobin level before she finally died.
Demonstrating that she remained alive and continued breathing toxic smoke after suffering multiple catastrophic stab wounds. The suffering associated with those final moments of life is almost impossible to comprehend. Sophia endured devastating injuries while simultaneously inhaling poisonous smoke as a...
Paul then burned his own house down to destroy evidence, leaving his wife and daughters homeless. At the sentencing hearing, the family finally spoke after 7.5 years of waiting. Jennifer's mother, Bonnie Cass, stood at the podium and told the judge, each of them looked at their uncle Paul as he killed them, killing them in front of each other like an animal.
Birthday, anniversary, family, holiday is now filled with pain. Paul Canero's horrific and despicable actions have caused agony and grief beyond what anyone should endure. In an act of pure evil, he took the life of 4 innocent people, his own flesh and blood, out of greed and selfishness. He disgusts us. He represents the very worst of humanity. My family and I live with traumatic grief, depression, and anxiety, worsened only by him dragging us through these 7 years. He never once exhibited any remorse.
Jennifer's sister, Bonnie Cuss, detailed the greed behind the slaughter. Keith had supported his older brother, but Paul became consumed by jealousy and greed. Paul's small mind, warped by jealousy and greed, turned into deliberate, calculating murderous deeds. They asked for maximum accountability.
Life, his success, and the man that he was. Paul's small mind, warped by jealousy and greed, turned into deliberate, calculating, murderous deeds. But Paul did not just take Keith and his family's lives. He tried to steal the legacy of a man whose character, compassion, and integrity he could never, ever come close to being. In his violent acts, he attempted to erase everything Keith built. As a father, as a husband, as a friend, and as a human being. But Paul will never succeed at that, never. Keith's legacy lives in every life he touched.
Then Assistant Prosecutor Nicole Wallace delivered the line that would dominate comment sections. The defense had submitted character letters describing Paul as a responsible person. Wallace paused and said, "One look at the evidence, the actual evidence that the jury sat and listened to, would indicate that the word responsible and Paul Canero don't belong on the same planet, let alone in the same sentence."
Same planet, let alone in the same sentence. This is a person who is living beyond his means, stealing from the victims, and then doctoring bank records to cover.
The defense attorney could only acknowledge the tragedy and note that consecutive sentences were merely another way of saying her client would die in prison.
They reflected a sustained and violent assault. Jesse suffered defensive injuries, establishing that he consciously attempted to protect himself from the defendant's attacks. Those injuries...
Paul Canero declined to speak, maintaining his innocence and showing zero remorse.
In light of what you've just heard, is there anything that you want me to say before I close sentence?
No, Your Honor.
Sure? Okay. The defendant was found guilty by a Monmouth County jury on February 13th, 2026.
That silence became legally fatal. When the judge began his sentencing analysis, he had to weigh aggravating factors that make a sentence heavier against mitigating factors that make it lighter. In New Jersey, this is not a math equation, it is a qualitative moral judgment guided by statute. The judge found 4 aggravating factors and gave each significant weight. The nature of the killings was especially heinous and cruel, with the children suffering prolonged far beyond what was necessary to cause death. Sophia's agony, trapped in breathing smoke while mortally wounded, fell squarely within what prior case law called the painful, dreadful killing of a child by fire. The children were particularly vulnerable. Paul outweighed Sophia by nearly 200 pounds and towered over Jesse by a foot, armed with a gun and a knife against defenseless kids. He found a substantial risk of reoffense based not on speculation but on the calculated planning, the 2-year pattern of theft that escalated to mass murder, and the total absence of remorse, which under State v. Rivers properly supports a finding of future dangerousness, and he found an overwhelming need for deterrence, both to send a message that the slaughter of children will be met with the maximum punishment and to specifically deter a man who had demonstrated he would commit any crime to protect himself. Then the judge walked through every single one of the 15 statutory mitigating factors, and the courtroom witnessed one of the most brutally concise legal pronouncements ever recorded. Factor 1, no serious harm. Inapplicable, he shot and stabbed 4 people to death. Factor 2, did not contemplate harm. Inapplicable, he planned it for hours. Factor 3, provocation, no evidence. Factor 4, excuse or justification, none. Factor 5, victim induced the conduct. The victims were defenseless. Then he reached Factor 6, which asks whether the defendant has compensated the victim or will perform community service. The judge's reply was devastating. Defendant can't compensate anybody in this case because he killed everybody in this case.
There was no evidence that defendant's conduct was induced by any victim. All victims in this matter were defenseless. Mitigating factor 5 is inapplicable. Defendant has compensated or will compensate the victim of his conduct for the damage or injury that he sustained, or he will participate in a program of community service. Defendant can't compensate anybody in this case because he killed everybody in this case. Mitigating factor 6 is also inapplicable. Number 7, defendant has no prior history of delinquency or...
The only factor he found applicable was number 7, Paul's lack of prior criminal record, and he gave it only some weight. The balance was 4 significant aggravators against 1 modest mitigator. Here is where many viewers might think the hearing was over. Life without parole is life without parole, after all. But the judge then turned to a question that carried enormous moral weight: whether the 4 life sentences would run concurrently, effectively treating the massacre as a single event, or consecutively honoring each victim as an individual whose life was taken by a separate act of violence. Under the Yarborough Guidelines, New Jersey law requires a careful analysis of whether crimes were independent, involved separate acts, and affected multiple victims. The judge methodically found that each murder was a separate act of violence with distinct means and locations. Keith shot on the lawn, Jennifer shot and stabbed inside, Jesse stabbed while defending himself, Sophia stabbed and then killed by smoke inhalation from the fire. There were 4 separate victims, and he declared, there can be no free crimes.
There can be no, number 1, there can be no free crimes. Punishment must fit the crime. 2, the court must separately state its reasons for imposing consecutive or concurrent sentences. Number 3, the court must consider...
He sentenced Paul to 4 consecutive life terms without parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for arson at his own home and for the years-long theft scheme that started it all. Even though a single life sentence would have kept Paul in prison forever, the stacking mattered. It meant each victim received their own distinct measure of justice, and it ensured no future legal development could ever undo the full accounting. Only then did the judge speak the words that renamed the defendant. He said, "Today, defendant's greed, manipulation, and selfish conduct ends. His address will forever be the Department of Corrections. His only reality is confinement, consequence, and accountability." He noted that justice had been delayed 7 years, but it had not been denied, and then he stripped Paul Canero of the identity he had tried to protect by burning down his own home. The caring husband, the good father, the victim of circumstance. You are no longer Paul Canero. You are an intimate number in the Department of Corrections. You are a quadruple murderer who slaughtered innocent children. That is your identity.
Defendant's greed, manipulation, and selfish conduct ends. His address will forever be the Department of Corrections. His only reality is confinement, consequence, and accountability. Punishment is paramount, and the court imposes it without any hesitation. While defendant will not acknowledge his behavior and wrongdoing,
the lesson here is not just about a monster being locked away. It is about what the law can do when a judge refuses to treat a sentencing hearing as a formality. Paul Canero's lack of remorse was not simply a moral failure, it was a legally operative fact that foreclosed leniency, blocked mitigating factors, and supported consecutive sentencing. His character letters meant nothing against the medical evidence of Sophia's carboxyhemoglobin level and Jesse's defensive wounds. The legal system, at its best, does not merely warehouse dangerous people. It speaks truth into the public record, it names evil for what it is, and it tells every future defendant who thinks they can lie, burn the evidence, and stay silent, that their silence and their lies will be used against them with devastating precision. When you hear a judge say, "You are no longer," followed by a name, you are hearing the law declare that a person's false identity is legally dead, replaced forever by what their actions prove them to be. That is a right every citizen should recognize and demand, because a system that cannot name evil cannot truly condemn it.